Today, we are joined by Mr. Patrick Grover, consultant neurosurgeon and clinical director at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery as part of the University College London Hospital. So Patrick, thank you very much for joining us today. Can you start off with a personal introduction and tell us a bit about yourself?
Okay, so I'm Patrick Grover. I'm a consultant neurosurgeon at the Queen Square Hospital, so National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery. I specialise in two areas, skull-based neurosurgery and vascular neurosurgery. So that's often really tumours at the bottom of the skull, sometimes that relate to the ear. So I work very closely with ear surgeons, and also vascular, which is blood vessels. So things that bleed in the brain, things like aneurysms, for example. And then I have some additional hats. I do management, so I've just started as the clinical director in our department. And then what we're talking about today, I also do academic medicine, particularly looking at using AI and robotics and looking at those applications to neurosurgery.
Thank you very much. And where did your interest in artificial intelligence begin in your journey?
Well, I would say primarily the last few years. So I work in what's called the TECH group. That's a collaboration between a lot of our clinician scientists and engineers at UCL. There are a lot of different technologies in AI which are coming online every year, and we essentially test and translate those technologies into our patients. Skull-based, for example, is often a lot of different techniques and technologies, like we probably will talk about gamma knife radiosurgery, but also different surgical techniques which lend itself to robotics and AI techniques to sort of improve our outcomes. And
what are some of the challenges that you feel that artificial intelligence brings particular benefits for in the work that you do?
Well, I mean, the challenge is really making these technologies translatable to real world problems. There is a lot of techniques that come online, and we might trial them, and actually you can generate a lot of information and data, but maybe not have that useful to our day-to-day. So the second challenge really is about data handling and confidentiality. So the NHS has a vast amount of medical data which we could plug into different models and generate really exciting output that can change care. But there's also issues around data handling, confidentiality, making sure we're doing it in the right way so that data is managed.
You're also, as part of this work that you're doing, you're starting a new project, aren't you? Can you touch on your artificial intelligence project?
We'll say it's a project, but really it's a portfolio of different studies, some of which have been going for a few years and some of which are newer. So I suppose if we break this down, AI technologies are essentially a process of taking a lot of unstructured data, labeling a portion of that data, and then using very high-level computing to come up with predictions about future states. And an example of that is ChatGPT, so natural language processing, but also you can do that with imaging. So an example would be how driverless cars work, so using different sensors, using that data to drive a car. And similarly, applying those sort of models to me doing an operation. And we tested these different technologies. So, for example, you might use natural language processing to look at all the patient's notes, to analyze the notes, see if we can find correlations that might change how we make decisions about patient management. So we've published some work on that around a pathology I specialize in, which is a brain tumor called vestibular schwannoma. And then another arm to what we're doing is around something called computer vision. So that's analyzing operative videos and teaching an algorithm to understand what's happening in an operation, using that algorithm to then predict what it thinks should be happening next, and then with that information starting to train new surgeons, inform the scrub nurse what to expect next, or to tell us what might be associated with patient complications or patient harm. And then the third string is really around image interpretation and image analysis. There's a huge amount of imaging data and exponentially increasing in the NHS and particularly neurosurgery, because most of what we do is based on scanning the brain and following things up over time. A very skilled radiologist can pick up and pattern recognize different growth characteristics, make diagnoses, tell us what to expect next. AI algorithms may or may not be able to do that better. So training algorithms on a lot of labeled patient data on imaging, and then identifying trends and making predictive models for what happens next is really the third strand, and that hopefully will improve how we decide about treatments and how we follow patients up.
Can you tell me a bit how that works from a logistical perspective? So what kind of data are you using, and how involved are you directly in creating these AI models?
So, yeah, in terms of logistics, we collect all this data clinically on a daily basis, and then we will have a range of data scientists and clinician scientists, PhD students, postdocs, who will be either collecting or extracting this data, and that will be the clinical notes, which are anonymized. That's going to be the scans, and also handling that data and anonymizing it. And then the third aspect is the operative videos. The operative video work that we're doing is really very novel, and we've already got some very exciting output on that. So we have algorithms that can really start to tell us what's happening next in an operation, even before maybe I'd have thought what's happening next. So that's really the collecting the data, and then each of our scientists, for example, will be physically teaching the algorithms to interpret the data. So say, for example, we're doing operative video analysis. Initially, you have essentially a blank slate. So although there's information in the video, the algorithm can't interpret that without us telling it what an instrument is, what the tumor is on each part of the video. So that's a very labor-intensive first step. You need to teach the algorithm on each video. And the other thing you need to do is structure what is very unstructured data in something very complex, like an operation. You need to generate a structure with some kind of consensus from lots of experts. And so that has meant going to our national society, doing what's called a Delphi consensus. So we take an operation, break it down into its constituent parts. We generate what we think is an ideal operation, and that includes the steps, the phases, what instruments we're using, what materials we're using. And then we send that out to the national society. We do Delphi consensus, where everybody will say, well, I think I would do this step, I would use this instrument, I would do this a bit differently. And then you come back with a scheme, so a structure of what we feel is a generic, ideal version of this operation. We publish that, and then we use that as the structure to then teach the algorithm about how to interpret a video.
That is a very interesting method of training, very strict framework to be using. But working with that, how do you then create an algorithm that's able to perhaps adapt when it doesn't match, things don't go as planned sometimes?
Yes, and what the algorithm is doing at the moment is pretty basic, but essentially we trained it at the moment on 40 operative videos. So based on that information, it's starting to say, well, I think we should be doing this phase of the operation whilst you're still doing the last phase of the operation. So to scale that, you essentially need to give it a lot more data, and that involves collaborating, so not just using the operative videos from your own centre, but then also then expanding that to videos from all the other centres, and then fine-tuning the algorithm over time.
And is that something you're doing?
Yes, so we're developing collaborations, particularly as a first step over in the United States. So we have very close links to the Columbia Neurosurgical Department in New York. So as a first step, they're collecting operative videos there. We can then develop an algorithm independently on their site, and then train the algorithms on both the data sets, and then just start to expand this out, and also collaborating with some centres in the UK.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned briefly a second ago about the novelty of what you're doing. Can you touch on that a bit further?
first in the world really in terms of codifying these specific operations, and then developing an algorithm that can give us information about what should be happening next in an operation. So that's certainly very novel, and that there aren't really any other centres in the world doing this in neurosurgery specifically. The other area is image analysis and image segmentation for benign tumours of the brain. We have a scientist called Jonathan Shapey, who's a surgeon who now works at King's, in our technique called gamma knife radiosurgery. So it's a focused radiation delivery technique for the same pathology, benign brain tumours. We developed a cohort of those tumours, designed an algorithm that can automatically contour the shape of a tumour on a scan, and then the next steps of that are to contour abnormal shapes of tumours, so residuals, for example, after an operation, which is harder to interpret, and then to do something called radiomics, which rather than just physically outlining the shape, also then starting to look at features of this tumour on a scan that you might not pick up yourself, but may be associated with, for example, growth rate or response to the treatment, treatment failures, that sort of thing. So moving into just using all that data to make predictive models about what happens next, and therefore adjust our decision making.
That's very interesting, because I'm aware of image segmentation models, but some of the extra layers that you're going to there, that's interesting, and particularly gathering those additional features. What kind of things can that help to inform in terms of patient care? So
we take the patient at the start of their journey. They are diagnosed with this tumour that grows from the ear towards the brainstem. It's benign, grows very slowly. But essentially you've got three options at the start of your journey: either observation, treatment with a focused radiation treatment like gamma knife radiosurgery, or an operation. And historically that decision making is made based on experience, serial scans, watching the tumour grow, taking a combination of factors into play like the patient's background and their medical status, lots of different things, and then deciding what we think might be best. But actually that doesn't really give you the full picture. A predictive model using AI with the appropriate algorithm can take a lot of factors in that you've not considered, like some signal intensity characteristics of the tumour that might tell you the growth rate in the future is going to be faster or slower, or a feature that might tell you that it's actually going to fail with the focused radiation treatment and we're better off doing the surgery at the beginning. And that's the kind of nuance that I want to focus on, so that you are clear at the beginning, based on AI predicting what is going to happen next, that you're making the right decision for the patient right at the start.
And ultimately, it's, if you think of it in an objective sense, if you're able to get a computer to be able to measure all of these components and make a decision based on it, it's more objective than a human making a decision, because even when you're talking about world-leading experts in a particular field, experts disagree on the same issues.
And there's lots of different reasons why people make decisions. And I suppose we're not saying that we would then train a computer to make the decision. These are tools that can help us make decisions. So essentially high-level computing, taking into account a lot of different factors, and then giving you more information and the information you need and the patient needs to then make the right decision. So that's what we are shooting for. I wouldn't say we're necessarily put all the information into a computer and it tells you yes or no. I mean, it's
Can you tell me in an ideological scenario how you would envision the tools that you're working on actually working in practice? So,
I mean, we can take each example if we stay on the themes of the operative videos and the image analysis for focused radiotherapy. With the operative videos, where we're moving towards at the moment is using these algorithms to give us feedback on steps we might have taken in the operation which may have resulted in certain complications which we may not have realised. So really training surgeons, but also giving us a feedback loop. We continue with the example of the vestibular schwannoma. There's two main complications. One is that the brain fluid can leak out of the wound after surgery and be a risk of meningitis. And the other is that you can injure the nerve that moves your face on that side, and you can get a facial paralysis, your face drops, which is a very severe complication and something which really should be avoidable as much as possible. And so you may have done a lot of these operations, and your rate of having the brain fluid leaks could be 15%, and your rate of having the facial weakness could be 5%. And the surgeon may not really know why that has happened, and there is going to be variability amongst surgeons, between hospitals, internationally. And so the operative video analysis gives us a structure of the operation and a feedback loop, so that we can use that in our we call them morbidity meetings. We can review the videos, and it can flag up a part of the video that it finds unusual, maybe around handling of the facial nerve that probably resulted in the facial palsy, and then we can iterate that and learn to avoid those complications and those harms. And then secondarily, for all the trainee surgeons coming through, they can do that virtually, so they don't need to be finding this out as they go along early in their training. They can be using that same process in a room, on a course, for example, looking at these videos and then identifying, where the point of the operation is that you've caused a harm. So I think that will be the big benefit of operative video analysis. For the imaging, as I say, it's really around fine-tuning our decision-making, developing those decision-making tools so that we can make the right choice for the patients. Also, fine-tuning some of the treatment parameters, for example. So we might use different dosaging regimes based on the size of the tumour, and we would benefit from more nuance in telling us exactly what the long-term outcomes are for certain treatment paradigms. So there's a lot of different benefits from that. There's also an efficiency benefit. So if an AI algorithm can immediately contour a tumour, tell you what's tumour and what's not tumour, for the planning, when we're treating complex tumours, it speeds up the process. We already have an AI algorithm we've started using called Lightning within the last couple of years, and already that has sped up the process significantly. So rather than having to physically plan each shot of the dose over the course of an hour.
Is this with the radiotherapy?
This is with the radiotherapy. Now we have AI algorithms that essentially use a formula to plan all these shots to make the treatment plan within a few minutes. So saves a lot of time.
And with all of this technology, how do you feel, you mentioned medical students there, how do you feel that this is changing the paradigm of how professionals are trained? Do you feel like it's changing now, or how do you think it's going to change in the future?
Well, definitely. I mean, you can see that just simply with ChatGPT. Just the expansion of use of natural language processing to accumulate data and train students means that they progress more quickly than we used to when we were at medical school. They also come through much more tech savvy. They're already experienced using these kinds of technologies, and it means that when it comes to translating it to medical uses, that all happens much more quickly. So yes, the whole aspect of this in training is, in reality, is going to be exponential. I don't want to get too blue sky about this, but if we think really long term, you're talking about things like quantum computing, brain-computer interface. These sorts of things will mean that our learning is going to dramatically increase, and that means all these technologies will develop much more quickly.
And what are you personally particularly excited about in terms of the work that you're doing, but also broader artificial intelligence concepts in general?
Well, I mean, I've just mentioned it, but brain-computer interface is something that is coming on very quickly. We have expertise within our hospital and within UCL, and it's an area where certainly the initial work is focused on rehabilitation. So particularly patients who are paralyzed, can't move their arms and legs, maybe they've had a stroke, for example, in their brainstem, or patients with motor neuron disease, and being able to interface with a computer there's been some incredible work over in the United States, and some early data with brain-computer interface, meaning that people that have, for example, not been able to speak for 20 years are then able to interface with a computer, and language and words will be generated, and similarly moving robot arms. And again, that technology will increase very rapidly, but also you can imagine we start with people in that context with rehabilitation, but in the longer term we might be using it for milder impairments, or even implanting into normal people for augmentation of learning and other things.
The technology for computer-brain interfaces has come a long way very quickly, and I think also artificial intelligence has actually played quite a key role in that, because you can do more with less information in some ways, can't you?
Well, precisely. I mean, what's fascinating about this is that you can put a very tiny microarray in a part of the brain that has suffered a stroke, and we have all presumed is not doing anything at all. But there's a small amount of signals still clearly happening in that region of the brain that might be the part of the brain that moves your left side, which is paralyzed. And if you connect that to a computer and you analyze the data and you use the right algorithm, you can actually move the robot arm. So we presumed that nothing was happening in this part of the brain, but actually you can move a robot arm, and you can start to rehabilitate.
That is astonishing.
So you can imagine, if you scale up your computational ability as it already is doing every 10 years, exponentially, that those progressions will be very fast, I would imagine, much quicker than we think.
Yeah, that's amazing. I was not aware of that. That's a very exciting potential. That leads on quite nicely to another similarly related topic that you mentioned earlier, and that is robotics. And can you tell me a bit more about your interest in robotics and some of the exciting work that's going on in that space?
Yeah, so robotics, very interesting area. I suppose the concept 10 or 20 years ago was that we could make a robot that could do operations that we would then not, you could then press a button, or you could be remote and it would do the operation for you. And there is scope for that in simpler operations, and there are certainly surgical robots like the Da Vinci robot, which is very useful, and in general surgery and in urology have come online and been very effective. In neurosurgery, the operations we do are extremely long and extremely complicated, and essentially designing robots to do that kind of work has not been possible. And if we have tried to design something for that purpose, it in general makes everything more complicated, so it makes the operation last a lot longer.
So there aren't currently robotics that are...
So there are robotics, and most of the robots that we use is more using, for example, trajectory guides, so automated trajectory guides for putting electrodes through the brain. That can speed things up. So we do that, for example, for monitoring different parts of the brain to identify which bit of the brain is causing epilepsy. And also a completely different aspect of neurosurgery is spine surgery, and we have a robot that can help make sure that you put screws into the spine in the right place and in the right trajectory. So for those aspects, yes, we do have robots, and they are effective and make things more efficient and more accurate. But for more technical operations like removing a skull-base tumour over 6 hours around all the nerves and the blood vessels in the brain, there's no robot that can do that. So we move more to the concept of robot-assisted surgery, and that might mean, for example, robotic instruments, so articulated instruments with a robotic element that you can use as part of your surgery to get around corners, and that's something that we're certainly developing for anterior skull-base surgery. So that's accessing tumours up the nose and using articulated robotic instruments to help with removing those tumours, but not necessarily doing the whole operation.
Extraordinary levels of innovation, and there's so many threads of topics that we could delve into off the top of that. So to keep the conversation on track, Let's go back to the imaging data that we were talking about earlier. Can you tell us a bit more about the collection?
Well, yes. I mean, this is something, again, that has been an evolution. All hospitals generate a vast amount of data by regular scanning, and that data is extremely valuable. So the use of that data in developing new diagnostic techniques, speeding up diagnosis and improving treatments is something that has huge potential to improve patient care. And there are lots of different companies working on it, lots of different techniques out there. Amazon, for example, has a wing that's collecting all of this data in the US. And some of the challenges here is, as we were talking about earlier, is about the patient confidentiality, GDPR, making sure that we are using patient data appropriately, that patients are consented for the use of this information, so that we are developing the right techniques, but in the right way. That's certainly an aspect of what we're doing at Queen Square, is making sure that we're doing it with appropriate confidentiality in the right way, but also we have the benefit of being a national specialist centre for this technique, gamma knife radiosurgery. So there are sort of two main centres for this in the UK. There's Queen Square in London, and then there is Sheffield, and we do very high volumes of benign and malignant brain tumours, and also vascular pathologies in the brain. That data is very useful for the development of AI techniques because it's very consistent data. So all the scans are done on the same scanner, all the pathologies are treated at similar times, the follow-up is done in quite a regimented way, and it means that in developing algorithms to understand the pathology, it's really gold standard data.
And that's really important, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. So having high quality data means that the techniques you get out at the other end is also high quality. So and that's why we've been able to develop these novel methodologies in image segmentation, for example, and looking deeper into that. So trying to understand more complex shapes, post-operative residuals, features of tumours that might make them more or less likely to respond to our radiotherapy technique or certain doses, etc.
And it's an interesting concept as well that you bring up about gathering these volumes of data through your institution specifically. And there's a comparison to be drawn. For example, we've spoken to people from Moorfields Eye Hospital where they're gathering very large volumes of eye imaging data and building a database of high quality images to help build AI algorithms. But the volume of data that you gather doing something like neurosurgery is not as high as you can get from ophthalmology or a field such as that. So how do you tackle the challenge of...
Yes, it makes it much harder. So then it's very important, your first step, you develop your algorithms in-house, but then collaboration is key. And so, we have strong collaborations. I mentioned with King's, for example. We were also a member of a international research organisation called the IRRF, so that's the International Radiosurgical Research Federation, and that's a lot of large centres, predominantly in the United States, but also around the world, India, for example, and there are very high volumes of patients going through these centres, and in those collaborative studies, that's really where the next phase is. So you develop your algorithms in-house, and then through collaborations with these major centres, you make them more internationally applicable. And
so do you share some of the data that you gather with other institutions that you're partnering with?
Yes, yeah, exactly. Primarily, yes. So certainly that direct link with King's, also a centre in King's collaborates with a centre in the Netherlands, but also through the IRRF. So we share a lot of data, and we write collaborative papers, particularly on pathologies where we may only treat a certain pathology 5 times in the last 20 years because it's so rare. So you really need to collect data from multiple centres, so 30 or 40 centres, and then you can really start to understand the appropriate treatment paradigms.
And just then you mentioned as well your research. You've done a lot of very interesting research. So do you want to talk a little bit about some of the more recent work that you've done, or some of the most exciting pieces that you've done?
Well, yes. I mean, I suppose we've touched on most of it already. I mean, the most of it is really those three strands. So natural language processing applied to really understanding our clinical notes. Part of that is something called process mapping. So again, that's developing consensus with national societies on a specific way of treating pathology, and then using AI to interrogate the notes and to see if we're doing that in the right way. So second strand, computer vision. Third strand, talking about the image segmentation. The last thing maybe I've not really talked about much is really national collaborative data studies. So this is done again with multiple different centres, but in pathologies like, for example, aneurysms of the brain. There are historical, very large studies looking at the behaviour of unruptured aneurysms in the brain, and a lot of those natural history studies based on populations, particularly in Japan, Finland, and to an extent the United States, but not necessarily applicable to a UK population, and only with certain numbers. So one thing we have the big benefit of in the UK is national societies and very consistent, well, relatively consistent data all collected within the NHS. So data sharing is a bit easier. And so I'm the local principal investigator for a study called the RAW study, so the risk of rupture of unruptured aneurysms. And that's run by Diedrich Balters in Southampton. And essentially that's looking at collecting all the unruptured aneurysm data we can from the UK, looking at natural history of aneurysm growth, predictors of aneurysm rupture, and then again identifying which aneurysms will rupture, which won't, and therefore which ones we should treat. And through that collaboration, collected data on over 20,000 patients, 20,000 aneurysms, and the results will be very exciting.
And building upon that sort of global picture that you're painting there, it brings up an interesting point as to what is the incentive in the UK for this technology. It's a question that we often come across when you're talking about healthcare, is who pays for this? Where does the benefit come in the UK health system for technology like this?
Who pays for it? Yes, I suppose the a lot of what we do is based on funding that we might get initially from research councils, from universities, from charities, and from the NHS in our professional salaries. But then to really scale, you need industry collaboration. And I think that's the area. For example, I work with a company, Amethyst, who developed the radiotherapy technique, the focused gamma knife technique, and they're funding a PhD student. So they're particularly helping them to translate these techniques into the delivery of gamma knife radiosurgery. And we talked about, for example, in the US, collaboration with Amazon. And I think those sorts of industry collaborations enable you to scale what you're doing maybe more locally in a university context or within the NHS to a wider audience and internationally.
So Patrick, can you now tell us a bit about how you take into consideration ethics and bias considerations with the data that you're collecting and the models you're producing, and how you're making sure that it's as widely applicable as possible?
It's a good question. I think you have to be vigilant and cognizant of this, and particularly keep assessing and surveying and monitoring the output of what you're generating over time. And it should be being fine-tuned with the appropriate level of accuracy. We're not designing algorithms or techniques that we then rely on in isolation at every step, particularly in medicine. For example, in radiology, you're developing a tool that might be an adjunct to radiology reports or our interpretation of what's happening, but always you have the overlay of the experts who are giving feedback and also continuing to train and develop your models and algorithms. I think the unruptured aneurysms is a good example, actually, because as I mentioned, a lot of the data that we currently use that has been developed for our decision making in unruptured aneurysms was developed in specific world populations in certain countries, and that does mean that your decision making could be slightly altered by the specifics of what's happening in that country or the genetics of that population relative to other countries. So it's important that what we develop is developed in a confidential way, but then open access. And so, for example, the image segmentation model we developed in radiosurgery is open access, and then other groups can develop their own models and refine their models, and they can be developed in parallel, compared with each other, particularly the accuracy, and then over time it should be an iteration towards something that's safe and applicable to everybody.
And how do you monitor the performance of tools like this? Because it's another conversation that we've had and been observing in the space recently, is that there's actually a massive issue with models once they're deployed, that you can have like automation bias, and there's different aspects that can affect how they perform in a real world situation.
Well, most of what we're doing at the moment is monitoring with experts. So ensuring at every level that as you're trying to utilise these techniques, that you have an expert on board who's really guiding the situation alongside. So this is an example of why in robotics, for example, you can't have a robot in surgery that you press the button and it does the operation by itself, because there is no substitute for a human understanding the implications of every move, being able to direct each move of their hand to do a certain part of the operation. There is no substitute for that. So we end up with robot assisted surgery, where it's a collaboration between you and the machine that's hopefully making parts of the operation more efficient, but not doing the whole operation by itself.
Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately, what do you think you're most excited for the future of your work?
I think the operative video analysis right now is the most exciting, because we're just starting to get the output from the videos that we trained. That's been a long process. It's taken years codifying the operations, getting the national consensus, getting to a point where we have an algorithm that can understand videos and give us output on what should happen next. So that is really at the cutting edge. Nowhere else in the world is doing this in neurosurgery, and something that we're now expanding to other centres, and then they can start to train their versions, and this will start to be very useful in how we do operations right now, and also how we're training the surgeons of the future in the next 5 or 10 years.
I was going to ask about how you distribute this technology, because you're a centre of excellence. You are a centre of excellence, so how do you make this technology accessible to institutions that aren't world leading in neurosurgery?
Yes, I think the development expansion to other centres is certainly an issue, and whether there should be an industry aspect to that or a business aspect to that. I mean, you are dependent on funding, and we have research funds available, but in terms of really expanding this to something that you can spread across the world, you need a lot more finance, and so industry collaboration, I think, is the way forwards in that respect. So a lot of the operative video analysis is done with partly with Medtronic who've helped set up this techniques, some of these techniques. So that's really how we then expand to other centres.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for sharing some of your insights.
Oh, thank you very much.